In the previous lecture, we started using the Xamarin Forms Previewer to take a look at the design of our application in real time as we make some changes to the XAML file. And we managed to identify a small issue with our design so far, and that is that there is no spacing to the left or to the right in either Android or iOS, meaning that the elements inside of the design just expand from edge to edge, and that doesn't look particularly good. And I mentioned that we are now going to take a look at margin and how to use it inside of XAML so we can solve this issue. So what margin will allow us to do is exactly assign some margin to each and every one of the sides of a certain element. In this case, what we want to achieve is to set some spacing to the left and to the right of each of the elements that we have in the design, the couple of entries that we have, as well as the button. And you may think that we want to establish the margin for each and every one of these elements, but notice that all of these elements are inside of another one, in this case a stack layout. And because the stack layout is the container for each of these three elements, we can actually set the margin into the container, and it will of course be applied into its children, because the children, in this case the two entries and the button, are always going to be rendered inside of the container. So if the container is suddenly small with a certain margin, all of its children are going to be re-rendered to adapt to the new space. So let's go ahead and do that. Inside of the stack layout, we're going to establish some margin. And to establish some margin, all we have to do is write down margin and type enter. Now the margin is going to have 4 values. And all of the 4 values we can establish directly between these double quotes. The first value would correspond to the value that we want to assign to the left margin. In this case, let's try 20. I notice that as soon as I write 20, this margin has been applied to both sides. In fact, it has been applied to all 4 sides, meaning that if we only write one value, this value is going to be the same for the 4 sides of the element that we are assigning the margin to, in this case the stack layout. And in this case, the layout already looks very good, but let's take a look at what happens if we add a second value. In this case, the second value could be 0. And notice that there doesn't seem to be any visible change. But what's happening here is that the first value, the 20, is being assigned to the left and to the right margin, while the second value is being assigned to the top and to the bottom margin. If we were to assign a third value, notice that we have an error because we cannot have only 3 values, we would need to have a fourth value. And this is the full representation of the margin. The first value is going to be the value for the left margin. The second is going to be the value for the top margin. The third one for the right margin. And the last one for the bottom margin. Now, since in this case we want the same margin for the left and for the right, as well as the same margin for the top and for the bottom, we can simplify this definition by just writing the value twice. Remember that if we have this definition, it means that the first value is going to apply to both the left and the right sides, and the second value to both the top and the bottom. If we wanted the same margin for all 4 sides, we can even have just one value in here, which will be applied to all of the sides in here. In the case of this login page, all of these 3 options work pretty much the same way because we do not have any values at the top or at the bottom of this stack layout, so we do not see the margin to the top or to the bottom, so we can actually leave whatever option we want. Now, there is another thing that I want to do in here. I want the button to have just a little bit more of spacing from the password entry, and so I'm going to set a margin for the button as well. In this case, I do want to set the 4 values, because I do not want to add any margin to the left. We've already established the margin of this button through the stack layout. But I do want some margin to the top, so I can add something like 50 to the top. In this case, this is going to be applied both to the top and to the bottom margins. But I do not want this bottom margin because in this case, notice that this doesn't look particularly centered. And that is because the stack layout is now high enough to get the entry inside of it, get the second entry inside of it, and get the button inside of it, but this button has 50 pixels of spacing to the top and also 50 pixels of spacing to the bottom. This means that the stack layout is actually high enough to be 50 pixels below the button, and that may not be ideal in this case. So notice what happens when I add a 0 for the right and a 0 for the bottom. Now the three elements are back in the center of the content page because now the stack layout starts right above the email address entry, but also ends right below the button. So we have pretty much completed the UI for a login page. In the next lecture, we're going to create a momentary logic that will allow the application to evaluate whether or not the user should enter into the application. We're not really going to evaluate against a database yet. We're just going to create a small evaluation of whether or not the values inside of both entries are not empty.